Hello everyone, and thanks ever so much for listening to my presentation, Mountain Biking in the Anthropocene. My name is Jim Cherrington and I'm a senior lecturer and researcher at Sheffield Hallam University. Outside of my day job, I'm also a committee member at the Peak District MTB Advocacy Group, whose aim is to improve, preserve and promote access interests for mountain bikers who both live and ride within the Peak District National Park. So over the past 3 years, I've been involved in two big projects on mountain biking. In 2018, I was the lead researcher on a project involving mountain bike trail builders. And last year in 2021, I was also involved in some really fascinating research on electric mountain bikers. Across both of those studies, we interviewed a total of 60 people, so 30 per study. And across both projects, we were really interested in learning more about trail builders and riders' relationships with nature and the environment. As an academic, this was a really useful exercise as it has allowed us to plug an important gap in the literature whilst also advancing our conceptual understanding of so-called nature sports within an increasingly complex set of environmental circumstances, particularly those that are increasingly being described through this notion of the Anthropocene. But as an advocate of mountain biking, such an undertaking is also important as it allows riders to tell their story and also allows the public to use these stories, or this data if you like, to make more informed and measured judgments regarding the mountain bike community. And one of the inspirations for this research actually was the increasing amount of abuse that's levelled at mountain bikers. And as a mountain biker myself, I didn't really recognise the characterisation of mountain bikers that was being portrayed in these individuals and often quite nasty conflicts. So how are mountain bikers thought of by other users of the countryside then? Well, in the UK, there are broadly three related objections to mountain bikers, and this is evidenced in the work of Katrina Brown, who's an environmental geographer and a political geographer. The first is environmental. So mountain bikers are said to destroy flora and fauna, disrupt local habitats, and most problematically, it's claimed, they're said to contribute to above normal levels of surface erosion. Secondly, you've got issues relating to antisocial behaviour, so mountain bikes going too fast, being rude, not getting out of the way, and so on. And finally, there are those, or many, who suggest that mountain bikers and the trails that they end up creating are kind of aesthetically ugly and generally a bit of an eyesore. Now, the upshot of these opinions is that we get a minority of individuals, particularly here in the UK, who get so angry about all of this that they end up resorting to verbally attacking people or vandalising authorised trails, or in some really extreme cases, actually going as far as trapping local riding spots to cause deliberate physical harm. So, for example, in the picture at the bottom here, you can see, of this slide here, you can see that there was some recent trail sabotage that took place in Grenoside Woods, which incidentally is my local riding spot in Sheffield. And in the top picture, we also see a shockingly well-constructed death trap that was found in Delamere Forest in the north of England a few years ago. In this presentation, however, I want to argue that contrary to popular opinion, mountain biking can actually serve to both mitigate the trauma associated with nature's destruction, I put nature in inverted commas there, whilst also helping to imagine a range of post-natural and post-growth futures. Here, I draw on two extant bodies of literature that have helped me personally to frame the mountain bike as a more than human influence in the context of the lived and the natural environment. Firstly, like many other scholars in sociology, philosophy and political geography at the moment, I recognise that after more than 12,000 years of intense agriculture, industrialisation, population growth and mass urbanisation, every corner of the globe now and every layer of the stratosphere now bears the scars of human activity. So we've got CO2 from fossil fuels filling the atmosphere, non-degradable plastics and human effluent polluting the oceans, and the excesses of human consumption serve as geological reminders now of humankind's catastrophic and often reversible impacts on the Earth's crust, something that's often being referred to now as the Anthropocene. Secondly, and by way of extending this literature, I draw on the recently translated works of the late Bernard Stiegler to better understand the creative possibilities and potential regenerative benefits that Anthropocene living can bring to, in this case, our discussion of mountain biking in natural environments. Specifically, I'm drawn to what Stiegler describes as both the entropic and negentropic qualities of human life in the 21st century. So for Stiegler, our desire for social and deliberative activity, such as those that might have been provided by old-fashioned forms of community or genuine and public political debate, is increasingly threatened by what he describes as instinctual drives, or what's otherwise known as entropy, which in turn lead to automatic, present-centered and nihilist forms of behavior. Now, this nihilism is nourished by both the allures of consumer capitalism, so buying stuff, as it were, which are said to promise people immediate gratification through the purchasing of various goods and experiences. But what's also relevant here is new informational technologies, or IT, which are seen as problematic as well, because according to Stiegler, they're said to subject human beings to calculative algorithmic processes, which result in one-dimensional or selfish relationships with the natural and ecological world. However, in contrast to much work on the Anthropocene, which suggests that humans have an inherent desire to destroy things, including the environment, Stiegler's writings on ecology remain stubbornly optimistic, which obviously is useful in this case study, because he points out that whilst all living things participate in local increases in entropy, so things becoming more singular, they can also at the same time produce forms of negative entropy, or negentropy, as he calls it, that counterbalance these tendencies. And this is most evident in my discipline in studies which highlight the Janus-faced qualities of sporting institutions, such as the International Olympic Committee, for example, whose supposedly green credentials are exposed when things like metals and harmful chemicals infiltrate swimming venues, or when governments, like those we saw in China, for example, deliberately manufacture clear skies to live up to their Olympic and environmental pledges. Clearly, what happens following these kind of revelations is that suddenly issues such as air pollution and water contamination become deliberative and globally ubiquitous, and are intensely scrutinized by the public, which is really good as far as I'm concerned, because what this does is it reveals both the limits of our control over nature as well as the excesses of consumer capitalism. Now, for me, this is exactly why the mountain bike should command significant attention in relation to ongoing debates around the protection of nature and environments, as well as the things like the countryside. Because although mountain bikes may at first seem counterproductive to the protection of the environment and these respective spaces, they can also help us to understand as scholars and as policymakers. We can understand these concerns in a really kind of direct and visceral way. And at times this can be very emotional. So, for example, when I go to Warncliffe Woods in Sheffield, and there's been a fresh harvest of trees for paper and wood, and that are there obviously for human consumption, it's awful. And it's quite an emotional experience because you never see decimation quite like it. Trees are removed, habitats are destroyed, and by riding in these locations, I'm directly, through my bike, exposed to humans' influence on the planet. Also, the controversies within which mountain biking and other technologies are embroiled can help us to make sense of how nature cultures and nature ideologies, which often determine who and what is permitted in certain spaces, are perceived, maintained, and enacted. So, rather than being the source of the problem, it's through the very inconsistencies that I've highlighted that the mountain bike highlights that what I believe can be important in encountering, witnessing, and reorienting to the end of the natural world. Now, in what time I've got left, I'd just like to give you a feel for how this was evident in the interviews that we conducted, with a view to expanding upon these, of course, on the 23rd of March. So the first thing that we found was that participants frequently talked about the phenomenological or the embodied and sensuous qualities of nature in the context of mountain biking. In particular, participants such as Andy here highlighted the sensuous qualities of riding in and as a trail builder building with dirt, when he says that it's not just dirt that's been dug up from the floor, but also the whole appreciation of it, that you can mold it, shape it, sculpt it, the sound it makes when you push through with your tires into a hard corner, the contact with your tire on the dirt. When I'm going out, this is one of the things that I'm looking for, because I love that sound. It's just an appreciation for what it is and what it allows us to do. Now, as many of you may know, if you've got even a kind of tangential relationship with mountain biking, dirt's widely celebrated within mountain biking culture, and it's often evoked to signify many important aspects and facets of mountain bike culture, including things like its history, its emergence, and various subcultural affiliations. And what we have here clearly is Andy articulating how mountain biking is one part of what might be described as an emergent assemblage, involving both humans and non-humans, such as dirt, tyres, and other socio-natural configurations such as sounds and collective appreciation. Specifically, we learn here how the participants' ability to bring something into being, so that might be an enjoyable ride, or if you're a trail builder, perhaps a rideable trail, demands a perspective which situates those practitioners as being actively engaged or embedded within their environment. So, contrary to ideological perceptions of the relationship between mountain bikers and the environment that I mentioned at the start, the use of equipment such as bikes, spades, or certain kinds of machinery wasn't here seen as a way of riders and trail builders mastering or conquering non-humans or landscapes. In fact, participants outlined how tool use can lead to an overwhelming sense of lameness, as they described it, when being exposed to the kind of the vast web of human and non-human relations at any given building or riding site. So Jason also talks about building a section of trail out of clay, for instance. And what he says is, with the dirt being mostly clay and roots here, what we find is even when I've been in with a machine, I have to have the bucket with the teeth on, and I don't so much dig as keep scraping with the teeth. This clay has been in the ground for thousands of years, and when you combine it with rain and everything else that's going on, it really starts to get heavy and gloopy. Even though the digger won't physically push into it, I have to use the teeth to break away 4-inch bits to then smooth them out. When we changed that trail, I had to do put what's called a diking bucket on, which is a 2x5 bucket, and it's hard. It's literally lifting the digger up because it's that hard. What we find here then is that the participants' exposure to the depth and the complexity of these assemblages illustrates the negentropic qualities or capacities of mountain biking. Since the more mountain bikers and mountain bike trail builders try to think about nature and their place within it, the more they're exposed to the infinitesimal connections, histories, materialities that are formed between the human and the non-human. What's especially interesting here, and what the work of Stiegler helps to elucidate, is that these discoveries, sort of controversially, are made in the presence rather than the absence of technology in supposedly natural environments. So mountain biking and mountain bike trail building contain an embodied but spectral relationship with the environments that they're dwelling in. But these embodied perspectives also seem to merge with wider societal concerns as well. And I think this was manifest most clearly in what participants referred to as the problem of trail braiding, whereby riders sometimes create an alternate and often unsanctioned and controversial line that's not envisioned or constructed by the trail builder. Though such trail braiding can be caused by various non-human factors, such as the flow of water or the presence of a fallen tree, its causes are more commonly attributed to the GPS tracking software Strava. And what happens here is that people deliberately ignore environmental concerns sometimes in favour of faster and more effective times. Here, I think it would be really easy to conclude that mountain bikers are acting selfishly to achieve better times and be competitive with other riders. But there were other instances that suggested how trail building and braiding actually increases negentropy. as it widens the riders, trail builders' horizons and increases things like social, technical, and ecological diversity. So, for instance, Will here talked about the impact that trail braiding was having on local flora and fauna. He says that bizarrely, that grassy area on the edge of X, which is the location, has got quite an interesting little ecosystem. Because of the salt that comes off the road, they actually get some plants that they don't get anywhere else. So we're really keen to keep the trails from braiding off into that area and to allow the grass to flourish there, because there's lots of wonderful flora and fauna. So these excerpts represent more than just individual manifestations of altruism, but illustrate how, in anticipating the future of different trails, these participants are actively locating themselves within the creative possibility of multiple assemblages. And this, to a certain extent, involves them projecting the objects that they use, things like trails, things like bikes, and developing an attitude that requires them to kind of temporarily decenter their own building or riding agenda, and to extend outward to all manner of expectations to ensure and ultimately further maintain the long-term integrity of the trail. And fascinatingly, in my discussions with mountain bike advocates, it was clear that these socio-natural and socio-technical complexities extended beyond their local environments and were in many cases helping them to imagine or enact new forms of political praxis that would help to legitimate the sport within natural outdoor spaces. For example, we saw advocates combining local and regional advocacy with national and international interest groups. We saw them even considering things like trail braiding as indicative of more national and global issues, such as the growing stigma around trespassing on private land, or relatedly, the growing concern of privatization and enclosure. So, whilst not wishing to downplay some of the genuine concerns, legitimate concerns regarding the social, cultural, and ecological impact of mountain bikes, what I've also tried to do throughout this short talk is to show how mountain biking also, and often at the same time, presents a challenge to this ideological precedent, highlighting the positive contributions that this increasingly popular form of outdoor physical activity can make to things like social and environmental diversity. Specifically, I've shown how the mountain bike and different trail building artifacts allow participants and mountain bikers and trail builders to be humbled by nature's spectrality, and thus, rather than resulting in a sense of dominance or entitlement over those landscapes and those objects in them, this, I believe, ultimately produces a sense of awe and lameness in the face of inconceivable complexity. Significantly, this was prompted by the presence rather than the absence of technologies in supposedly natural environments, which, as I hope to have shown here for Stiegler, shows how certain technologies are actually, rather than being removed from us, are intimately tied to our sense of humanity. Finally, I hope to have demonstrated that by being open to a difference of opinion and by discussing these differences at various levels, between groups, individuals, advocacy groups, and as well as including global issues, mountain bikers and mountain bike advocates are willing to not only share their experiences of environmental protection, but to learn about the intricate body-bike relations that occur within various times, temporalities, and locations. Thus, in serving for a medium for the interweaving of individual and collective environmental concerns, as well as social and natural ontologies, it's my claim throughout this presentation that the mountain bike necessitates a form of attunement that's responsive to specific socio-material assemblages of the hybrid body bike, whilst at the same time helping to offset the trauma that may increasingly be associated with life after nature. Thanks very much for listening, and I really look forward to speaking with you on the 23rd of March.